Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this Friday evening. We'll be discussing really interesting and timely issues about. Before we start, I just want to remind everybody that we'll be live streaming and recording this webinar. So it's up to you to turn on your webcams or not. Welcome to our webinar on Kurdish youth politics. My name is Bahar Bashar. I'm associate professor at Durham University at the School of Government and International Affairs. I have been working on issues related to Kurdish politics for a while now, and I'll start by introducing how our book with Shivan Fazil came about, and then I'll leave the floor to Shivan to discuss this further. Shivan and I became partners in crime for an edited book on youth identity, politics, and change in contemporary Kurdistan a couple of years ago, when we were funded by the Ellen and Nesta Ferguson Trust to work on youth politics in the Global South. It was part of a larger project. We were actually looking at 5 different case studies from Bosnia to Algeria and from Kurdistan to Afghanistan. And other researchers who are based at Coventry University were involved in this larger project. Shivan and I wanted to understand how young people in the Kurdish region of Iraq can participate in political processes, can contribute to peace-building practices in the region. And then the more we research on this topic, the more we understood that actually there wasn't much academic work on Kurdish politics that specifically focused on young people. And we wanted to challenge that, and we have conducted fieldwork in the region at different periods. This included focus groups, semi-structured interviews, and we were so surprised to see that most of the academic work focused on other groups than young people. But this issue is really timely and important because many young people participate in protests in the region at the moment, but also they are feeling alienated from political processes at the same time. And there is a significant segment of young population who actually dream about leaving Kurdistan, as the recent migration trends show. So we wanted to pay attention to this topic. And as a result of our first research activities, we have published this edited book by Transnational Press London, Youth Identity, Politics and Change in Contemporary Kurdistan. And the main idea was also to contribute to decolonization of Kurdish studies and to raise the voices of Kurdish scholars on this topic. So our book has 10 chapters, and most of the authors are either based in Kurdistan or are of Kurdish origin. So I have just done the editorial work as a non-Kurdish scholar, but I was so pleased to contribute to such an interesting and innovative book. And the foreword was written by Karvan Jamal Tahir, who was the KRG representative in London. So we have really critical interventions on different topics, from youth political participation and prospects for democratic reform by Munir Mohammed, to chapters by Sofia Barbarini, who was a journalist in the region, about youth and nationalism. We have also chapters on educational policy, about the LGBTI rights, religions and national tensions, as well as radicalization. So the book is available online if you want to see who contributed. But we are very happy to see 2 of our authors here with us today. And now Shivan will give you more information about our project and about our findings, preliminary findings, and then we will introduce our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bahar. So my name is Shivan Fazil. I'm a researcher at the Middle East and North Africa program at Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. I work and focus on drivers of conflict and peace and issues of governance in Iraq, particularly challenges to stabilization and good governance in the wake of the conflict with the so-called Islamic State. But the topic of youth has been of academic and personal interest to me, and we've been able to bring together quite distinguished group of scholars, colleagues, to contribute to this edited volume. As Bahar highlighted, we have 10 chapters in the book by scholars of Kurdish descent, either based in Kurdistan or originally from the Kurdistan region, that from an interdisciplinary approach tackled different dimensions and aspects related to youth identity and politics and change in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, or in contemporary Kurdistan. So in addition to the mix of scholars of Kurdish studies, both of origin or of Kurdish descent, or international scholars who have had interest focusing on the Kurdish region, we also have actually struck a very good gender balance. We have 5 male contributors and 5 female contributors. I know gender identities are a very complex issue these days, but just to say 5 men and 5 women, at least the way they have identified themselves. What actually struck me is that after our book was out on 1st of September in 2021, just a few months after, many aspects and many topics and themes that were tackled in the book by the colleagues were manifesting themselves in one way or another, whether it was, for example, youth political participation or lack thereof, or attitudes to contentious politics in the Kurdistan region, or gender dynamics related to young people and youth, but also the overall political situation in the Kurdistan region, whether it's the securitization of public space and how the two ruling Kurdish parties have been ruling over the population in the Kurdistan region, and even countering violent extremism, or how religion and issues of faith is kind of played out among the region's population, young population per se. Again, we are very thrilled and honored that we have 2 of our colleagues and contributors of the book joining us. I will, before I hand it back to Bahar, perhaps I will give a testimony to how some of the issues that we have tackled in the book are very relevant, and how they are continuing to manifest themselves. So 2 weeks ago, we had students from public universities across the eastern part of the Kurdistan region of Iraq. That is usually the stronghold of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, that includes the provinces of Sulaymaniyah and Halabja, as well as the 2 independent administrations of Garmian and Raparin, taking to the streets against poor housing conditions, and also demanding the government to decrease or reduce tuition fees, but also demanding the government to resume a monthly living stipend that were cut as part of austerity measures that first came into place in 2015. And this was the 2nd year in a row that university students would take to the street to ask for the same grievances or the same demands. And if you all remember, last winter, we also saw how footages of young people, or migrants, but primarily young people from the Kurdistan region of Iraq, grabbed international headlines. They had all taken the perilous journey because of lack of loss of hope at home, but also in pursuit of finding happiness and better opportunities elsewhere that were not found at home. So again, just a couple of examples of how the scholars who contributed the book, tackling migration or gender or youth protests, etc., or political participation and thereof, are continuing to manifest themselves and playing out on the ground. So I'm going to stop there and hand it back to Bahar to introduce our first speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shivan. So we would like to start with Dr. Bama Nouri. He has recently written a book called Nepotistic Elites, the Kurdish Global Refugee Crisis and Global Insecurity, and how the two-party KRG has squandered generations of youth to maintain a declining and unpopular status quo. And he is a lecturer in international relations at the University of West London and an honorary research fellow at City University of London. He is also an independent investigative journalist and writer with interest in American foreign policy and the international and domestic politics of the Middle East in general. And Bamo is the author of Elite Theory and the 2003 Iraq occupation by the United States, how US corporate elites created Iraq's political system. So Bamo, thank you so much for joining us, and we are looking forward to hearing more about your research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Absolute pleasure to be here. First of all, thank you to the Centre for Kurdish Progress for hosting us. And of course, Dr. Bahar and Kakshivan for organizing, and of course, to fellow author Dastan to also be on the panel too. I have a bit of a tickly cough, so if I go off on a coughing fit, please bear with me. But yeah, today I want to kind of begin by highlighting one of the key diagnostic problems that we face when it comes to analysis of Kurdish issues and politics, and of course, youth precisely. This diagnostic problem is that analytical focus is predominantly centered around the immediate politics and political system, and in particular turbulence, which then basically creates the impression that all of the Kurdish region's problems are political and can only be solved in a political arena. Although this is partly true, there are various other dimensions of Kurdish issues which don't quite make or become the focal point of analysis, which then impairs the analytical lens of understanding in terms of actually understanding the true nature and effect of political outcomes, i.e. the aftermath or repercussions of the immediate politics. For example, political disillusionment in the KRI or the Kurdish region of Iraq, including the Kurdish region's contribution to the global refugee crisis, with the number of global refugees now, Kurds included in that figure, but kind of global numbers are now stacked at 100 million global refugees. That's according to the UNHCR. For the region itself, other factors that don't get talked about enough, which I want to kind of illuminate, also include things like, very worryingly, drought in the region due to the actions of the neighboring states, Turkey and Iran, and of course, climate change itself. All of these things affect the Kurdish youth, given that the majority of Iraq's population, where the Kurds of Iraq are kind of part of forming, around 70% of Iraq's youth are actually under the age of 35. And it's a statistic that we don't often kind of contemplate on or think about enough. And what I also tried to illuminate in this, again, hopefully brief talk, is to basically expand that analytical lens, and in particular, the intricacy in which repercussions develop and go full circle, and the complicity of foreign governments, be it knowingly or not, in supporting the roots, which today I'll kind of highlight as the Kurdish authoritarian elites. And those roots basically in terms of the causes that those roots basically bring in terms of key issues that I'll talk about in a bigger context. And that bigger context will be to draw urgent attention to the severity of the repercussions of the political crisis. I will state, that was a very long introduction to the talk. Hopefully the talk can deliver now. I will state that Kurdish elites in Iraq have kind of become a catch-22 for European and American nation states, but I will kind of come back to this later. Firstly, my chapter in the said book, which this kind of talk today is based on, the youth politics in contemporary Kurdistan. Without going into any detail, extensively, the chapter basically demonstrates through empirical evidence the way in which patronage politics, clientelism, partisan institutions, and constitutional violations by ruling elites in the Kurdish region have implications that span far and wide. One of these repercussions, is youth disillusionment and despondency, not to mention a youth mental health crisis, which is rapidly growing still, all of which has massively contributed to a global refugee crisis, all of which I'll try to contextualize. Of course, the emergence of ISIS in the region created hundreds of thousands of refugees. globally, some of which found temporary safe havens in the Kurdish region itself. But what's interesting is that the same Kurdish region causes its own refugee crisis. For example, there are camps in northern France where Iraqi Kurds live in muddy makeshift camps in their masses. As it stands, every month, Kurds from the Kurdish region basically flee in their thousands, preferring to risk death in crossing uncertain shores and borders in the pursuit of life as it should be. For example, Lutka, the Foundation for Refugee and Displaced Affairs, from January to October 2021, some of those statistics actually highlight that 37,000 refugees fled the KRI in that period, excuse me. And in the last 7 years alone, around 633,000 Iraqi Kurds have left the Kurdish region, with hundreds dying on the way. And it was only when around 140 migrant Kurds from the Kurdish region messaged the UN High Commissioner for Refugees through the International Federation for Iraqi Refugees Facebook page that more about their reasoning for migration started to actually reach to the mainstream. And their reasoning through this particular channel was due to the instability of the KRI, or Kurdish region of Iraq, in terms of security, politics, and religion. In another statement by the International Federation for the Iraqi Refugees, they also stated how difficult their journeys were, including, suicide, rapes, and loads of other kind of terrible atrocities that basically caused long-term and short-term psychological illnesses. It was only in last year's Poland-Belarus border crisis, where the majority of the estimated 1,000 migrants turned out to be Kurds from the Kurdish region, that the plight of the region came into the mainstream consideration again. And a few weeks ago, for those that are in the UK, a documentary on the UK's ITV platform entitled The Crossing captured the horrific and deadly journey of the migrants who died last year in the Channel, most of which were Kurds from the Kurdish region of Iraq. And even the guys who were doing the trafficking turned out to be Kurdish as well. And the fact that remains that we kind of continue to hear about migrants who cross the deadly seas in search of life, but talk little about the base routes and the causes of migrant journeys. And that brings me on to the topic of global insecurity and accountability of foreign governments who support the Kurdish regional government. Of course, there's been a recurring theme of all the stuff I've covered in my research, violently repressing dissent in the Kurdish region since 2011, which has not only increased protests against the ruling parties in the region, in particular the KDP and the PUK, has also seen further growth of political opposition movements. The interesting observation I want to make in this talk particularly is that despite the Kurdish region's two-party authoritarian government being well documented in wide-ranging and extensive reports of constitutional human rights violations, there has been actually increased support from free, democratic and human rights observing states. And the question that I want to raise is, to what extent should foreign governments through diaspora channels be held culpable in supporting the KRG or the Kurdish regional government, albeit for their own national or foreign policy interests, in an intricacy that has contributed to the global refugee crisis? And this expands further in implications as mass displacements severely disrupt national security and stability of sovereign states, thus contributing to the kind of global insecurity that I want to allude to. And what I specifically want to stress here is the current and cyclical catch-22 situation that continues to develop as states from Europe and North America pursue their economic and security goals through Kurdish elites, the KDP and PUK, which I'm sick of mentioning their names. They're wittingly or unwittingly overlooking the fact that it is these very elites who contribute to a significant part of the global insecurity crisis themselves. To elaborate, the UK, US, France, Germany, Canada, for example, are amongst those nation states who support the KRG. Kurdish elites who face a legitimacy crisis at home actually appear to enjoy legitimacy amongst some of the world's strongest economic powers. The president of the Kurdish region, Nechirvan Barzani, regularly meets delegations from various human rights supporting countries. Only last month, UK PM Rishi Sunak sent a warm letter to the Kurdish region's Prime Minister, Masroor Barzani, with warm references to the UK's commitment to strengthening bilateral ties. Meanwhile, an article a few days ago, must be like a week ago now, highlighted how the Kurdish region's president, Nechirvan, gifted the departing Boris Johnson a £4,000 limited edition second-hand bike, roughly the same value of what it costs migrants to leave the Kurdish region. So on the one hand, the UK has this kind of massive migrant problem. And when you go to the hotels and you actually do some outreach work to meet these people, the majority are Kurds from the Kurdish region of Iraq. And I've been kind of dragged into hearing some of these accounts in a kind of consultancy capacity with lawyers that have contacted my institution to get like an expert report. Otherwise, I wouldn't have ever understood the true nature of it. The Kurdish region is also deemed to be the epicenter of French Prime Minister Macron's Iraq strategy, with loads of meetings that we saw last year. Germany, which was ranked third in the top 5 for human rights respecting countries, sorry, which I'm sure Destan might correct me on a few things here, as it's her state, has a history of arming the KRG in the fight against ISIS, and also regularly holds diplomatic meetings with the Prime Minister. In North America, the KRG's relationship with Canada, who's a country ranked #1 for respecting and upholding human rights, was that their relationship was epitomized through the outgoing Canadian ambassador to Iraq, Shannon, basically stating that the national ambition of it was a national ambition of Canada to develop stronger ties with the Kurdish region. And of course, we all know about the US relationship. Last year, there was an article by Zach Coplin that went into the mainstream, basically shedding further light on the activities of one of the families, the Barzanis in America, demonstrating based on clear evidence how American corporate secrecy laws are used to hide pillaged Kurdish public money, basically from the KDP side, as well as a conspiracy to basically defraud the US government on more than one occasion. And this is kind of some of the things that I wanted to kind of highlight, even though these families and parties were known to be, proponents of freedom and democracy, they're now committed to authoritarianism. And this has mass, repercussions, basically. Now, there is, of course, encouraging roles for diaspora, given that 1.2 million Kurds live outside the Kurdish region, with thousands living in the Western countries mentioned in this article. And I want to also, in this talk, I want to kind of very briefly talk about the region in the context of climate change and how this also is going to intensify the already existing and growing refugee crisis, which really affects the youth more than anybody else, any other demographic. And of course, most worryingly for Iraq, which probably the viewers and those on the panel observed during this year, August 2022, Iraq had the highest temperatures in the world. And the last decade has basically made it clear that the existing corrupt political system won't be able to deal with the challenges of climate change, let alone any, other institutional, economic and social challenges which continue to be left unaddressed. Iraq is actually now the 5th most vulnerable country to climate breakdown due to soaring temperatures, severely diminishing rainfall, and intense droughts, which basically cause a massive water scarcity. And of course, there's also frequent sand and dust storms. Iran and Turkey's water policies have further shrunk Iraq's water resources at a time when this, youthful growing population is rapidly in need. Water demand is basically increasing. And that's where the KRG needs to basically, take a reality check and prepare and plan in order to deal with a large scale of environmental change. But the issue is that, as it stands, this kind of divided elite, the key legacy of the US occupation, which I talk about in my own book, doesn't have the capacity to deal substantially with issues outside of the one-dimensional priority of ministry budgets and paying salaries, because this is where the majority of political efforts and economic budget from oil revenues go in Iraq. climate migration and displacement is already a huge thing in Iraq, and it's projected to rise exponentially in the immediate future. Iraq's so-called, the example that I give today, the safest and most prosperous part, the Kurdish region, with its own regional government, is an example of how authoritarian and corrupt elite governance are central in causing these widespread implications, including the mass refugee crisis. And in summary, really, to kind of highlight something that hasn't changed much since that chapter in the book was written, the epitome, if you like, of youth despondency in the Kurdish region was personified in 2018 by the famous case of Rehat Hamad Aziz, an 18-year-old clarinet player from Halabja. Rehat basically won first place as a solo musician in the well-known, prestigious annual Rwanga Awards. The very next day, after performing in his bedroom for the last time, he took his own life. 1 in 5 in Iraq now face mental health issues. That's statistics that are outdated. Probably you're looking more like, 2 in 4 or 2 in 5, very, very serious mental health crisis that's very, very under reported, with the youth basically at the forefront of these increasing statistics. This indicates how out of touch Iraq's authorities are with their youth population. And there's little surprise then in the fact that many Kurds, especially the youth, continue to flee the Kurdish region in search of a better life, even at the expense of death. Finally, to conclude, the repercussions, if you like, of a dysfunctional political system span far and wide, not only squandering the current generation of youth, but also future generations. I know I give quite a long take on it, but I thought to focus things away from the chapter itself in the book which this talk is based, to kind of really highlight some of the issues that continue to unfold for me as a researcher, but constantly bring me back to the roots of these issues and how we have, even in our analysis, have been so one-dimensional that we've not been able to identify the roots or focus on longer-term solutions. So apologies, I probably raised more questions than I did in terms of providing insight, but that's my job as a researcher, which keeps me going, I guess, and that's my part. Thank you, everybody, and for putting up with my coughs as well. Apologies for that.
Thank you so much, Bamo. This was an excellent speech, and yes, you raised a lot of important questions, and I kept taking notes during your talk, so I'll have a few questions after, but I think our audience will have questions as well. So I now leave the floor to Shivan to present Destan, and thank you again.
Yeah, excellent start of this conversation, actually, and now it gives me immense pleasure to introduce our next speaker, my dear friend Destan Jassim. Destan has recently written on the differences and similarities of youth protest between Erbil and Baghdad, the two cities, as kind of pilot study that she has focused on. And Destan is also a research fellow at the Giga Institute for Middle East Studies, and also a doctoral student at the Friedrich Alexander University Erlangen-Nuremberg, and a member of the Giga doctoral program. Her research mainly focuses on the civic culture of Kurds in Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey, as well as on security developments in the Kurdish regions of those countries and in the Middle East broadly. Now I'll leave the floor to Destan to give us her opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Shivan. Thanks to the Kurdish Progress Center for Kurdish Progress for hosting us, and thank you both for moderating this. It was a great pleasure to work on this overall project and this overall book because, as already mentioned, a lot of analysis on the Middle East is very elite-centered. Everyone thinks that they have it figured out by looking at parties or sects or religious groups or ethnic groups, and it's just not like that. Like every other progressed and kind of modern society, other issues are really influencing how people are acting, and whether they are Kurdish or Shia or Sunna is more of a production of the material circumstances that they're in. So I'm happy that in this edited volume, we were able to look at the issue of youth. A lot of people are either trying to romanticize the role of the youth, or they are trying to, let's say, completely ignore it, because obviously, if also for politicians, it's a very dangerous scenario. As Bamo said, the majority of the population is young, and in 2019, during the protests, they have shown what they are capable to do. So what I was trying to do in this chapter was to basically look at whether we can see a difference between the political culture of people born before 1990 and after 1990, so a generational difference. I wanted to see if there's a difference between Kurdish and non-Kurdish people, which in Iraq by majority is Arab people. And I wanted to see what role gender is playing, because obviously the gender aspect is also very important. And as we see in Iran right now, the gender aspect is one that can...
USB, yeah.
Is someone unmuted or something?
Sorry, maybe I can ask everybody to remind themselves to mute themselves, and we will have, of course, opportunities for Q&A at the end.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Well, yeah, so we see that the gender aspect is very important. So that's kind of like the three axes that I'm looking at, where I was looking at data. In general, I'm very much looking at things with survey data to criticize survey data, the way it is collected in the Middle East and especially in Iraq. So what I'm doing in this paper overall is also to show how grossly underrepresented Kurdish people are in these samples, how there is no transparency in what language these surveys are actually conducted. Often they are done by survey institutions that are sitting in Baghdad, and there is no clarity on how these questions are translated. So there's a lot of problems that I'm talking about. And actually this year I was conducting my own survey in Sodani language, Sodani Kurdish language, Badini Kurdish language, and offering a first survey that is actually also respecting the language diversity. But that's part of my doctoral research. That's not something I can present here right now. Also, one part of the issue that I'm discussing, but unfortunately have no data for, but I'm discussing in general in the topic is in the chapter is the issue of mental health. As Banu said, it's a huge issue. And when you compare Kurdistan region and the rest of Iraq, there is also a very big difference in the sources of mental health problems. So we see that kind of for a lot of Kurdish people, it's inherited trauma and reproduction of trauma, whereas the security threats that the rest of Iraq was facing for the last, especially 20 years, are so decentralized that there is a atmosphere, a culture, a situation of fear that has deeply influenced the young people there and the trauma that they're going through. So the theory that I'm using in this paper is the civic culture theory, not because I'm a big fan of it, but because when you're working with survey data, you only have limited variables that you can use. And these variables are often reproducing theories that are established in political science. So in the case of civic culture, it is taking variables that are asking for people's trust in political institutions. So the army, the parliament, all of that. And how much people are interested in politics as independent variables. And the dependent variable is a index which is measuring support for democracy minus support for autocracy. So basically it's a measurement of how much you honestly support democracy, not only on the paper, but it's also, taking points off if you support army rule, if you support expert rule, or you support a single leader having all the power. And the civic culture theory basically is saying that there is a positive correlation. So the more people trust their institutions and the more they know about politics, the more they support democracy. But there's also a big discussion which is saying, well, this is kind of outdated because a lot of people that are critical of their institutions, they support democracy. In the Iraqi case, you could also make the argument that actually democracy is not something that is considered something very positive, because democracy was brought to Iraq and, you know, they got Nuri Maliki and Muqtada Sadr. So that's kind of not necessarily a nice definition of democracy. So there is quite some issues here, and also, as I said, with the data, there is a lot of things that are lacking. But overall, we see that you know, in the outcome of the survey data, we see that there is a difference that you can see between people that are born before 1990 and people born after 1990. So you can see a generational effect, and that some of these variables do have an effect for the older generation, but for the new generation, everything is pretty much left and right. You don't really have an idea what's happening. So that's telling us that the things that are moving the young people are actually quite different than what is the stuff that we are thinking in, the categories we are thinking in, and all of that. But another aspect is that for both the Kurdish and non-Kurdish sample and the older and the younger sample, for all these samples, the strongest positive predictor for support for democracy is actually gender. And that's a very important point. So being a female actually is a very strongly positive correlation with support for democracy and being against autocratic systems, which is also something that is very important if we look at the double economic marginalization that we have. Because when people talk about modern Iraq and modern Kurdistan region, they often talk about, you know, the regime change or something like that. But what also changed was the mode of production. Whereas before we had a very much a state public system, now you have kind of a party monopolist capitalist system where the parties are offering state jobs, obviously, because they are taking care of the ministries and the offices and the governorates and all of that. But you have a huge shadow liberated market, which actually was introduced by the NGOs that were promising to liberate Kurdistan region, massive liberalization. And this has led to this liberalization actually leading to a very, very hostile situation, especially for working class people that do not end up in this government/party system of public work. And that is something that is strongly correlated with age as well, because the older people, they all somehow got to get a niche in this party job system. But for the younger people that are much bigger demographic, they cannot really get into that get into that system. And someone is commenting Badani and Sorani are not language dialects. I said Sorani Kurdish language dialect, or, you know, but I do know what a dialect is. Thank you. So the double economic marginalization of women also came into this issue, because care labor traditionally in Kurdish society, just as in other societies, is something that is given to the women. But at the same time, they are really facing a lot of issues getting into the party political system, which is very patriarchal itself. So most of them end up in very low paying jobs that are in the private sector, and therefore they are double marginalized. So they are marginalized in their households, they're marginalized for all the care labor that they have to do, taking care of the house, taking care of the children, and taking care of all the other things that the family system is still demanding them to do. But at the same time, they have to bring in home as much money as the husband, most of the cases even more money, and are because of that very much marginalized. Also, there is you know, no real implementation of labor laws. There are some labor laws in Kurdistan region and also in Iraq overall, but they are not very implemented very much, especially if you look at the really big companies that are hiring a lot of people, being in connection with the political parties, which in turn are influencing the judicial system. Then you might end up, you might not end up having a good situation, being able to fight for your rights. And so that is a really, really big problem that is very much understudied, very much underanalyzed, but that makes a lot of sense, that then being female is actually, making you be part of a democracy that just in their everyday life, in their everyday marginalization, have to push for more democracy and more acknowledgement and more participation, because their rights are basically taken away from them. Another context that especially this year is important is all of the rampant gender-based violence that is happening against women, and that has actually become much, much worse. So what we have seen before in Kurdistan region, especially starting from the Kurdish protests that happened in the context of the Arab Spring 2010-11, was that there was an oppositional movement, but this oppositional movement was not really able to create an alternative. They were co-opted by KDP and PUK, so there is no real political opposition left. So there is also no political opposition for women left, right? The problem that we have right now is that a lot of people, instead of like having no political alternative to KDP and PUK, are turning to Islamism, quite frankly, and they are turning to a social media kind of Islamism, which is very much influenced by alt-right, religious, radical, and quite frankly, extremely sexist and violent people that all have big TikTok channels, YouTube channels, Facebook channels that have millions and millions of followers, and that are taking the public grief, but they are turning it into something that is mostly directed against women. So if you look at the media system in Kurdistan, when you look at what people are actually debating, they are in most cases not debating what is actually important to them, but most of the cases they are, for example, debating women influencers, which are also called models, which have become kind of the center of all attention in Kurdistan region. They are discussing what women should do and not do. They are discussing how women are manipulative, women are this, women are that. It's a very hostile environment that we're seeing right now. One of the recent cases is the smearing campaigns that have been happening against the Center for Gender and Development Study, where I have been working myself, and which has been labeled repeatedly as a center which is trying to make youth gay. And this has kind of been a fake news that was put in by a person, by one of these Islamist influencers, who, by the way, radicalized himself in London, which just tell you something about the political culture of London, maybe, and who has said that this center is turning people gay actively, and now people are reproducing that. So they are also going against the very basic institutions that could help these women. That is also problematic. We have seen a record number of femicides. Earlier this year, we've seen the murder of a trans woman, Doski, who was living near Durg, was actually in Germany, came back for a visit and was killed by her brother, who then fled to Germany. There is absolutely no news to this day what happened to this case, where this man is, whether he was found. All of this stuff is very much influencing the reality of these women. And Bamo has talked about, diplomacy and the role of Western countries supporting the Kurdistan region. And what I would say is, I would actually expand this argument and say, what we see is that for all of them, Kurdistan region is where they are kind of basing their Iran politics, Iraq politics, Syria politics, Turkey politics, all of that. But at the same time, they are using virtue signaling to use the suffering of women, use the suffering of queer people, use the suffering of underprivileged people to simply have kind of a PR version of having some activism for these people, but there is no real help for them. So also for women that are marginalized, that are seeking shelter, the possibilities are really, really grim. But overall, we see, as I said, in the case of Iran, the suffering of these women cannot be ignored. The suffering of women can generally not be ignored. And women are very much the foundation of any societal change. And we have seen in Tahrir protest 2019, we have seen in all of the protests, also the student protests in Kurdistan, women, young women had very much a leading avant-garde role. And this is what we can expect for the future as well, especially when the situation stays as bad as right now.
Thank you very much, Dastan. This was excellent. So, and again, a note of thank you to all our dear participants for joining us. I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Bahar, and perhaps we can kick it off with some questions to our speakers, and then we will open it up to the floor to our participants. Go ahead, Bahar.
Thank you so much, Bamo and Destan, for these great presentations. I mean, you both focused on different aspects. So Bamo had the IR perspective and he delved into domestic politics, and Destan, you gave us a gender and youth perception from your quantitative studies. So I want to start with a question, taking the opportunity of being the moderator, and then perhaps Shivan can pose another question, and then we'll open the floor for discussions. So Shivan and I worked on youth politics in the region, and we have talked to many young people who were really disillusioned with the politics at the moment. And I mean, they all had different reasons, but one of the things we encountered was that many people were saying that perhaps the generations before us, they joined the struggle, you know, most of their parents, especially fathers, were Peshmergas, etc., and they joined the struggle. And for young people, their perception of reality was different than those who were born after the Saddam period. So they were saying that we don't have to be grateful for what we have. We can always strive for more democracy, more development on human rights front, but our parents are kind of grateful for what they have, and they are not pushing the boundaries on that regard. Would you agree with that? And my second question is then, when we talk to young people, they really told us that, you know, they have this everyone save himself first kind of approach, because they didn't have this, you know, collective movements, social movements in Kurdistan where they could join and make their voice heard. So do you think these platforms exist? And when we talk about youth protest or youth politics, what are the first civil society organizations that come to mind? Thank you so much.
Does Destan want to go first, or should I go first? Well, one of the things that you talked about is a fascinating conceptualization. So the older generation, let's say my parents' generation, or pre-1990 is a good way, as Destan coined it. They grew up on the struggle, basically. You know, let's say my grandparents, they were Kurdish businessmen. They were quite wealthy, got to meet Saddam back in the day. Whatever spare money they had, they would send in the form of resources to Peshmergas in the struggle. This is what they grew up on. Part of that culture as well, which we still have, is to respect your elders, to respect people in society, to not, you know, necessarily have bad disagreements with people. That kind of generational approach in seeing, you know, the Kurdish, let's say, city occupied by Iraqi Ba'athist forces and Ba'athist police. Of course, this youth generation never saw that and never saw the value of the oneness and accepting or seeing, let's say, these political parties, seeing them as the savior, which, you know, at one point in history, no doubt the Peshmergas, KDP, PUK played a massive part in Kurdish history. Of course, there's both sides to the story. The problem is that this generation now are in a completely different world. And what always kind of brings me to question the situation further, to analyze it, is that the world has changed since then. The world then was Kurdish survival in one part of broader Kurdistan in Iraq that didn't face the instability that it has now, the basic service issues, and basically it was just a survival thing. Now the world has changed, the way people live changed, people's expectations have changed, social media, the right to life, the right to a certain quality of life. All these things now have increased youth demands, you know, 1,000-fold. So the youth today have different expectations of what a state should be, what a society should offer them. And this then, when they want to basically go for that, which is what the liberal ideology tells them, you've got 9 million people that are on the public sector payroll in Iraq. The 43% that voted in the last elections also total to 9 million. So those who vote in the elections, they vote for their political parties that give them their jobs, basically. And those 9 million tend to be the parents of this disillusioned youth that want to go out there and, protest and change the system. But their parents, for them, it's all they know. So you've got one generation kind of holding on to that continuity to what to them is the best form of security they know and they can get, and a whole new generation that wants to break free. It's almost like the parent versus the rebellious child context. And that's definitely something that exists today as a dynamic. I think that was your first question that you asked, and I can't remember the second question, so I'll let Destan speak, and if it comes back to me, I'll intervene.
That's very good. Perhaps Destan, of course, you are welcome to respond to the second question, but I also know that both you and Bamo alluded to and mentioned or highlighted a bit about the political economy of the KRI, but it's actually quite important maybe to provide a bit more detail on why is it, for example, difficult for a young graduate of a public or private university in the KRI to find jobs or elsewhere in Iraq. So the nature of the political economy and of course, why is that, of course, frustrating the youth in finding, for example, other opportunities or the next phases of life after completing education?
Well, I mean, since Ba's last question was about the everyone save themselves mentality, that's kind of connecting to that as well. So, I mean, one basic problem in Kurdistan region to start off is the education system itself. So you have a public education system, which is most of the time pretty hard, pretty underfunded, with pretty horrible teachers. And then you have a private schools where I don't promise that the teachers are much better there, but it's very much unregulated. And for money, you can kind of get a better degree, you can get through easier, and then so look, your economic status is very much directly influencing how your outcome is going to be education-wise. I mean, we have this correlation in a lot of countries, but there it's kind of playing out indirectly by how you're living, where you're living, how long you take to school, how much your parents can afford for learning materials. But in Kurdistan region, I mean, one example that is quite obvious is that there are still public schools. There are still public schools that have like chairs that are from UNHCR, like that's telling you how much is invested into these places, into these schools. Also, there is not really like a centralized organization of the educational system itself. So depending on what school you're in, depending on whether it's private or public, you have a very different level of education and very different level of content that you're getting. Also, we shouldn't forget that there is a huge influence of religious schools nowadays as well. So especially under the underprivileged people, there is a huge influence of these kind of programs as well. In the 2000s, we had a massive influx of Fethullah Gulen schools in Kurdistan region before the organization was eventually took up by Erdogan. So a lot of young people were not even socialized in any Kurdish way. Like they were socialized as pretty much young conservative middle to upper class people in Turkey were. So that's also another issue. So we cannot even talk about a Kurdish youth that is in a social sense socialized in some similar way, and it's only a region of 8 million people. Like you would not expect there to be so much variance, but there is in Kurdistan region. So on top of that, the issue is that finding a job is simply not connected to your qualifications, but in most of the cases it is connected to wasta, which is connections, having influence, knowing people. So the problem is that with the private schools, you might not have the most amazing or hardest school, but you get connections and you know other people's parents and you know other people that are there and all of that, and then you get in there and then you maybe might end up having connections to the private sector or some of the bigger companies. And when you go to public university, if you go to the students' unions that are political, then you also might end up making some connections and making it up into some nice jobs. But overall, the pathway is mostly leading into the private sector, and the public sector, which is in most cases paying more, like kind of better, is full. Like it's full of people. It's full of people from the older generation. They cannot take up any more people. They also have to pay the salary for all of the people what's it called? All of the people that went out of work or have health problems or all of that. So that system is still there. The welfare system is still there, but they cannot afford it anymore. So that's a problem. And the private sector itself is simply very much connected to the party. So if you somehow have connections, I know a lot of quietly, unqualified people that have simply made a job because their dad or mom is someone's cousin or has been in a party with someone and all of that. And that's not motivating people. And unfortunately, the discourse that the political elites are playing is also very much insulting to young people, because the discourse in many cases is representing a kind of a neoliberal culture where it's like, maybe your CV is not good enough, or maybe you have not watched enough TED Talks, or maybe you have not, developed a good public corporate design for yourself or something, when it's simply not like that. So that's the one thing. The other thing that I wanted to add with the difference with the parents also is that, I think this generation would like to change something, but, a country or a public that has been involved in a revolutionary movement is more likely to do it again. Whereas in Iraq, you never really had a revolution that would come from the people and that would be successful. You mostly had a toppling of the system by the military or by outside powers. So that's also influencing how people have a political culture of thinking they can organize politically or not. So I see that there are groups of young people, especially in Suli area, that come together for, artistic stuff, for cultural stuff, for theater. I mean, there was a theater play this year, which was very political, and what a lot of people, were very amazed by it, and that was mobilizing a lot of people. But further than that, it's just too dangerous to do it. I mean, one thing that students told me last year that were in the protest in Erbil was that they said, well, there were people our age that come from political families that are related to the parties, and they would take pictures of us when we would go to protest, and then they would send those to the people representative in the university. So there is also a lot of fear. I think a lot of people would like to organize, but it's just very dangerous.
Thank you very much, Dastan. So Bahar, how do you want to take it forward? Please take the floor, and maybe we can open it up for the participants.
Yes, thank you, Shivan. I was going to suggest the same thing. So if anybody has a question from the audience, you can write it in the chat, and then I can, I start with Sid. Lakit, he appears first in my page, so I have to unmute you. Is that okay now?
Okay, yeah. Both of you are very interesting, Dastan and Bamo, and you've raised so many questions, but I won't ask all those questions. Let me just give a bit of a context where I come from. I live in Cape Town, South Africa. And there's a small Kurdish group here. I mean, I could probably count about 10 Kurds in the whole of Cape Town. But there's quite a strong connection to Kurds in the Kurdish region of Turkey. And that is a connection which goes back to Abdullah Öcalan and a well-known judge that we had that was advising Mandela. So we do get delegations of Kurds coming down, and we've recently had a delegation of a youth. There were about 3 young people two of whom came from Rojava and one from Germany. So they were very strongly PKK aligned. And then there's also, from time to time, we have others. We've had delegations of women. We've had women actually giving presentations by video. There's one from your Kurdish region in KRG, Horzen Aziz, gave a talk to a group of women here. It was a video call. So we have these connections, but we're a very small Kurdish group here. Now, so my question is, you've only spoken about the KRG. You've not mentioned other regions, because none of those delegations have mentioned the kinds of problems that you're raising about the youth. In fact, the youth delegation seemed to be quite positive about their future. And none of them spoke about the problems with the gender issue. So I'm just wondering, maybe you've got a different perspective. I'd be very interested to hear that.
Destan, please, you can start.
So obviously there is other challenges in other countries, but I can surely tell you that the average Kurdish young person in Ahmed, in Mardin, in Qamishlo, in Kobani, in Mahabad, in Bokan, they are facing the same problems. There is a lot of unemployment, there is a lot of insecurity, there is gender-based violence, there is all of these things happening. I guess that most of the people that were in this delegation, as you said, are aligned to a specific political group, and they are entertaining a specific political utopia, which is very much their right to do so. And entertaining a utopia is, you know, also consisting of being optimistic about something. Otherwise, you wouldn't support that utopia, right? And the problem in these kind of contexts is that the critical stuff that we talk about is often lost. And on a personal level, I can only say you need both. You need to be realistic and talk about the bad things, but you can also not fall into a nihilistic political anger and just be like, everything is horrible, I cannot do anything, which is kind of the Iraqi Kurdish way to go forward with these kind of problems. But overall, these problems are really, really everywhere. If you, for example, look at the war that happened in Turkey 2015-16, it was highly influencing young people. A lot of young people were killed by Erdogan during these wars in Cizre, in Shirnak, in Nusaybin, in Ahmed, in fact, in all of these cities. In Rojava, we have a huge crisis. A lot of people that I talk to that are in Kobani right now, they are like, if the Turkish invasion will happen, we have to ultimately leave. There is no possibility. And in Roshalat, in Iranian Kurdistan, it's the same. People are economically underprivileged. A lot of young people have to either go into the cities or they have to take very dangerous, low-paid jobs. So these problems are really everywhere.
Can I just quickly respond to that, Dustin? Because you say the threat on Rojava is coming from Turkey. So it's not an internal problem that they have with their leaders. So that the youth certainly, I mean, they'd want to move away if Turkey attacks. And I've been to Ahmed twice, actually, and I've been to Surush, which is just across the road from Kobani. So I've met a number of youth, and I don't want to dispute what you're saying about the youth generally, but it seems to me there's a very particular reason why people in Rojava would want to leave now if Erdogan's about to attack.
Look, whether they admit it or not, there are all the other Kurdish groups also have criticism towards their own Kurdish parties. That's a fact. They are critical everywhere. But the problem is, or the difference is that the monopoly of power in Kurdistan region is with KDP and PUK. So they hold the arms. So most likely when you're violated, it's because of them. In the other parts, people might be critical, but you have Turkey, Iran, and Syria, and ISIS, and all of these other factors. So as Bamo said, you know, that's the same situation that Kurdish people in Iraq were in 30 years ago. There was one big enemy, so you just kind of chug it down, you know, call it a day, and then you go into your defense, and then, you know, you try to build up something, and then you say, okay, we deal with our stuff later. But that's simply that's not the case for the Kurds in Iraq anymore. So, there is internal Kurdish discussions, but when you have to face Erdogan and F-16s, then, there is a priority. Yeah.
Thanks.
And just to kind of add to that, I think as a scholar, I'm very much interested in all the parts of Kurdistan, but realistically, as probably Dr. Bahar would tell you, it's difficult to get around to it all in a lifetime, let alone in a research period. And one of the things that is interesting is that the Kurdish region of Iraq. Why we probably speak about it more in a deeper context is it's meant to be the model, the first ever positive advancement in this four-piece quest for nationhood. The closest it ever came was an autonomous region in 1992 that became formally respected and acknowledged in Iraq's constitution in 2005 with an established, parliament, government, president, whatever. So that kind of creates a space and a focal point of accountability and analysis to see, okay, what is this, entity? What does it call itself? How does it operate? What are its apparatus? Then as scholars, we can, or researchers, analysts, we can kind of analyze it from that angle. The other parts of Kurdistan, the research is not as, I don't want to use the word scattered or disintegrated, but it's not as structurally organized because the developments are quite primitive. And also it's the Kurdish region is meant to be the pinnacle, that whatever, almost like how the British or the Anglo-American approach to Africa in the 50s and in the 60s in the decolonization movement and these new states. The mentality of Chatham House, for example, at the time was whatever happens in South Africa is going to be the trend of what happens in the rest of Africa. So the Kurdish region is almost like the Kurdish region of Iraq is the pinnacle for Kurdish plight. And when you kind of then look at what happens in Iraqi Kurdistan and the responses of neighboring Turkey, Iran, Syria, predominantly Turkey and Syria, since 2005, you then see how much of a concern this Kurdish region has caused. You're seeing now Turkey and Iran use the Kurdish region as the Kurds as a scapegoat. Oh, there's a terrorist attack in Istanbul. It's Kurds. Let's bomb the northern part of Iraq. Iran is now blaming them for the linking them to the protest movements as big antagonizers. So you really kind of see through different instances the mentality, if you like, of the different states. But I think the research on all Kurds in all capacities is still quite primitive. So we're kind of getting round to it, but that was I wanted just to kind of bring that into the forefront.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bamandestan, and thank you, Sid, for the question. I lived in South Africa for a while myself, researching on Kurdish activism and similarities between Turkish and the South African peace process. So I met Essa Musa and I visited Baran quite often, so I can see where you're coming from. And the Kurdish movement, which was active in South Africa, was actually getting a lot of support from the Communist Party and from former ANC activists as well. And it was so interesting to see that the Kurdish issue was understood so far away from Turkey's borderlands. But there are different movements in different parts of Kurdistan, as my colleagues mentioned. So, but when it comes to young people, I think in the Turkish context as well, issues related to political economy, employment, crisis is the same. So I've recently penned a report about how young people in Turkey dream about leaving the country. Recent surveys show that 76% of young people want to leave Turkey if they are given the opportunity. That means even the AKP supporters themselves want to leave. So this is a growing trend in the Middle East in general, but I think Iraq and Turkey have their own inherent problems, and young people think that there's a better life waiting for them outside. Hopefully this will change in the future, but the future elections do not give me so much hope as well. But thank you so much, and greetings to Cape Town. Mr. Avat Mustafa, we can have the next question. I will try to unmute you.
Hello, it's good evening. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for all the speakers. Actually, it's a very interesting. Just a very briefly to introduce myself. My name is Avat Mustafa. I was a former consultant for the World Bank, RAND Corporation, then Barzani Charity Foundation. Currently, also I do the translation on Kurdish, Arabic, Kurmanji, Sorani, as well as I provide the expertise report for the immigration lawyers, mainly for their asylum cases. There've been very interesting, really, discussion tonight, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I may disagree with some of the part of the speakers. However, overall, it is quite fascinating, and then this is what happened exactly in Iraqi Kurdistan. I just want to make a 2 point on this. I think would be very grateful, or I know could be very difficult, but also what I think would be very useful for your research. Also add the background of those Kurdish Iraqi who are massive, in a massive number have come to UK to claim asylum, and then there are many on the way to come. I am a translator where I can't really talk about specific cases, or I can't really reveal anything very personal, or because of the privacy law. However, from my experience working with the mostly asylum seekers in the UK as a translator, actually one of the things I have noticed is, which is very unfortunate, majority of them, I would say, not just a few, majority of them are very uneducated, not really politically were quite activist or active, the reason they come to this country. By the way, I'm not saying there is the issues that already has been mentioned about the monopoly of politics, the corruption, everything that you mentioned. I'm not saying doesn't exist. I'm talking about those people who come to this country. That's really very few have, I would say, they have issues with the Iraqi Kurdistan region government, either KDP or PUK. I think it is very much like it's been now a fashion for many Kurd, especially the younger one. They are under 25, to leave Kurdistan and come to UK, where I spoke with many of them. In one hand they are quite happy to be here. In another hand, they realize actually they thought it's a milk and honey on the way, but they know that wasn't the case. So I think it would be very useful for your study if you can get into this specific part also to realize, what is going on, because one of the issues that these people have even those who've been here for 10, 15 years, they have a reintegration problem with this British society. I see they're isolated. They really can't get into there's education or just a simple communication. So this is one of other challenge, I would say. Another obstacle would be for the Kurd, which is the number are growing very fast. Estimated 500,000 Kurdish people live in the UK now. Majority of them from Iraq, obviously. They are coming from other parts as well. So this is one of the, I don't know, it's a question or whether just I recommend if you can study on this and then to see what is the future or what their expectation here that now they left in Kurdistan. Other question I will have for either Dastan, or for anyone, or for whoever's answered this. Of course, your study is very much focused on the problem part rather than the solution, which is it's understandable. I wouldn't say you are very pessimist, but there is, the future is very, I would say, very dark. The way you mentioned the future of Kurdistan, political economy and society, really, somewhere in a gray area. I always wonder, in your view, what the future of Kurdistan would be in the next 5 years. And then just to really echo what Dastan said about who is really capitalizing of the issues of Kurdistan, which is the Islamist group, I agree 100% with her. It's the only, in my view, even in the UK, by the way, the only group, the Islamic group, whether they are political or non-political, they are capitalizing on the vulnerability of the Kurdish people, the corruption, the unorganized, or let's say the problem, the long-standing problem between the two political parties are the Islamic group who really are taking advantage of that. I have seen, and then I'm sure some of you, most of you are in the UK, you see there is the Kurdish society moving away from a liberal parties or liberal movement, or they are walk away from the mainstream politics. They have actually nowhere to go, but they go to the mosque. The mosque, of course, it's a place where is a holy, I respect, we all do, but the mosque is not just for praying, but also it's a place where the people either could be radicalized or they can have a complete view about the future of Kurdistan, which is also not that great. I see this is another, I would say, not just an obstacle, but also a danger to the Kurdish society in the long term. So this is something I think should be studied more. The more research should be done within the UK and other European countries. But the UK is actually, I would say, the second home for most asylum seekers coming from Iraqi Kurdistan. So thank you again for the opportunity, and I hope I have expressed my view the way that could make sense to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mustafa, for the insider opinion as well, and from a practitioner's point of view. So, Bamo, do you have any response to this, or Destan?
Yeah, coughing permitting. Very, very nice introduction, Kagawat, and a nice context. And I'll give an example. I mean, as researchers, I mean, Stan may or may not agree, our job is really to understand things more at a deeper level. But being Kurdish and being limited in scholars, there's always the immediate expectation for solutions, and it's never that simple. And I'll give you an example to highlight that, right? So we talked about solutions, or we talked about the problems in the Kurdish region, and I'm the biggest optimist. If you look at my work, I always try to end on a optimistic way. The solution in the Kurdish region for the youth to not come to Europe, to not risk their life, to not become mental health victims, because once you get scarred and you get traumatized, that trauma will never leave you. That will come out in the way you deal with your friends, your family, your children, and it'll be passed on through generations, right? That's, primitive research on trauma will tell you that. What those youths need in Iraq's Kurdish region and Iraq period is a stable free market and a hierarchical system where you can start somewhere and you can work your way up, you can earn your money, and you can live independently of the government. And from there, when you have a free-flowing privatized market, people work, people are busy with these things, people have careers, and they have aspirations and aims. Right now, there's a system of control by these political parties, which everybody knows about. And what would happen? How do we vote in the UK, for example? In the UK, when it comes to elections, whether you're Conservative or Labour, you vote for the political party that serves your interests in the demographic that you are. So you might be a youth, you might be a student, you might be, a pensioner. Each political party has an issue or policy that you vote for them on that particular issue or policy. In Iraq's Kurdish region, people vote for the party that pays their wages today. The rest don't vote. There's 57% of people that were eligible to vote that basically didn't vote. So what does that tell us? That there's a massive vacuum to win an election with a political party that actually has an idea and a vision and an ideology that is targeted at the youth, right? But why and how do these political parties prevent that from happening, and how do they maintain control? The answer to that is that if we had a free functioning private sector in Iraqi Kurdistan that wasn't monopolized by political parties who act as mafias to, take tax off people as and when they want, when these businesses become big, if we had a privatized industry, then people wouldn't vote for KDP or PUK. They would vote for the political party that serves their interests. So you wouldn't see any votes for these traditional political parties. But because we have this public sector control mechanism, or jobs for votes, as I talk about it in the chapter of this book, people, large numbers of unemployment. There's around 700,000 youth that enter Iraq's workforce every single year without prospects. They're prone to extremism, prone to, for example, wanting to leave the country, so many different things. The solution is a free market where the government doesn't intervene and we basically reduce the public sector system. That's not going to happen, because if that happens, these parties won't get elected. Not only that, if you have a privatized state and you have a more unified government, we start to produce our own goods and services. Who would that annoy and upset? Turkey and Iran. Iran dominates Iraq's market. We have a massive consumer market of around 40 million Iraqis. How do they have access to those markets? Through these political parties that we have. That's just, I hope that's clear, Awad, that the solution is so intricate and complex in terms of how you'd apply it. And I think for us as scholars is to make things as clear as possible, to make the answers and the solutions as obvious as possible. And they are quite obvious, but I think we still need to probably understand a hell of a lot more before we can even think to apply, because a lot of this is new. There's no other Kurdish state or autonomous Kurdish region in the world to draw examples from. The Kurds are unique in their own culture. Kurdish politics has its own unique ramifications. We're still a long way from solutions, but we are optimistic that we're somewhere on that road. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Bamo. So we can have a final, very quick question from Mr. Hana Chamani. Yes,
thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you. But first of all, my English is not good because I have been started to speak English for 5 months. Actually, I know me that before we were friends together on Facebook. Thank you. Maybe I'm the best case study for those, especially for Dastan Khan and Kak Bamo, because I'm one of them who left Kurdistan recently. It has been 10 months about. You always talked about crisis economy, but I think it's not true. When I was in Kurdistan last year, I had a good job, best salary, best places, best car, everything, I had everything. But I left Kurdistan because I was in the dangers in Suleimani and Arbil. They threatened me to kill me because I wrote lots of things on Facebook. So I know many friends, many relatives, many people in Kurdistan who have been jailed just because of wrote a comment. Criticized government, parties, PDK and PUK. Recently, 500 employees inside PUK has been cut their salary because they criticized PUK because of July incidents inside the PUK. Most of them, they want to leave Kurdistan. Believe me, Kagbama and Dastan Khan, most of them, because I always write something or things about Europe in my Facebook, I get lots of, so I got lots of comments, emails, messages on Facebook, Instagram, to Kakana, please just tell us how can we find a way to live. I want to leave Kurdistan. I want to come back. I want to come to Europe. And ask them why. They say there's no life, there's no guarantee, there's nothing. I want to believe me. There are some people who have cars, house, wife, everything, even employee of KRG. They want to leave Kurdistan. They want to come to Europe. I told them that Kurdistan is better than Europe. Please don't come. They say no. We don't have a good life here. We are in the dangerous. And I have two questions, Kagbama. The first one is, you said most of the Kurdish people, they have issues of mental health. Could you tell us what do you mean exactly, mental health? The second one is, so what are the reasons that Kurdish people of Iraq, I'm talking about Kurdistan region of Iraq, why they want to leave Kurdistan to come to Europe? What are the reasons? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chamani. So we can also mention the political reasons of why people are leaving, and then we'll wrap it up quickly. So final comments, Bamo and Destan? Destan, you go first.
Okay, Mr. Hana, thank you for your comments. I was friends with Nagihan Akarsel before she was killed just across from my neighborhood, so I'm very aware. And I would like to, not have a situation where we're talking about one topic and we're assuming that people are neglecting the others, but we have to focus on things sometimes. But I am very much aware of political oppression and repression. And if you would Google my name, I'm not the type of person that would have an easy travel for Kurdistan region right now. So, just out of respect to know that. And the question overall is like, I mean, of course, people are critical and they get killed for that. But if you simply look at the majority of people, the question is not only if they get a house and a wife and money, whereas I wouldn't say that the wife is a commodity that should be put on the same level as the other two items. But overall, of course, it's a lifestyle question. It's about whether you can see your life developing into something more than what it is. It's the idea of growth, right? And Kurdistan region is not really giving you that. But the question is, do we have the environment? And this is something that I also want to ask Kakawat, also saying that, as Kakabamo said, like, we're researchers, we're not really, I mean, I'm not the type of think tanker that is giving grand schemes of how to change things, but I have to kind of also give us overview of what the situation is right now. The question is Kurdistan region a place right now where, let's say, a creative, a free, a happy spirit can develop? I don't think so. Like, every time I spend more than 1 month in Kurdistan, I'm calling Shivan to tell him about something else that completely is freaking my mind out. To be honest, it's a very hostile place, and it's psychologically hostile, and people are psychologically hostile to each other. So it's very, very draining. It's very horrible, and it makes people do a lot of horrible things, and that's also part of why they're fleeing. So I would also ask Kakawat, I know that there's a lot of people that are not very educated and they come to UK and they're not integrating, but do you think that, like, Kurdistan region is producing that kind of very, happy, open-minded, laissez-faire kind of person? The most people that I know that have lived there for such a long time have been humiliated in their everyday life so often, to the point that they cannot even, like, have the kind of, like, let's say, communal openness and these kind of things that it needs to be in a society like Western societies, where people just simply don't have the problems that you have there, So, I mean, you go from one city to one city, and you have to expect at every checkpoint that someone is gonna freaking insult you or do something bad with you. That changes people's mental health. Also getting on that mental health problem. So I think it's, of course, not only about economic issues, but we also have to deal with the data, and there is an economic problem at hand, and the economic things are also influencing the other parts. And maybe just to add on, because I saw this question pop up in the chat, so I can just do that. Look, Rojava is a great example, but people have to understand Kurdistan region is in a post-revolutionary situation. No one is going to do a revolution again. People have their revolution. So they're in a completely different state of mind. And that's something that these political movements, and I'm very sympathetic, I'm a leftist person myself and all of that. I'm very sympathetic with that. But if you want to allude to a specific group of people, the mentality of Kurds in Iraq is very different, because they're 31 years, 32 years into having had their revolution, and it didn't really bring the outcomes that they want. So we have to do something else to sell a revolution to them and change to them than in Turkey or in Syria or somewhere else. And there were feminists. Like, I mean, I'm from Khanaqin. Leila Qasim was the first woman to be killed in the fight against Saddam Hussein. You know, there is a feminist heritage in Iraqi Kurdistan, but unfortunately it was destroyed by also, as I said, patriarchal system, nepotism, corruption, and also Islamist forces, and they're all playing together, unfortunately. So yeah, they look at Rojava. I have a lot of Kurdish friends from Iraq that went to Rojava to fight against ISIS. Like, there is a lot of relation there, but when it comes to the values and the political system, it's a different situation.
Thank you so much, Dastan. Bamo, do you have anything to add very shortly?
Yeah, very, very shortly. Yeah, I think the coming back to the points about the Kurdish region, and I totally appreciate obviously having a car, a job, a salary. You know, these are these are good things to have, but a society's offering in terms of expectation nowadays is much more than that. I mean, once you get the salary and the car and you're a bachelor, for example, you're thinking about getting married. What happens when you think about getting married? You think about your children, and you think about their, life process and that kind of linear liberal expectation that youths have nowadays of, life has stages. You do this and you live this type of life when you're a youth, then you go and morph into your adult life, and then you have like a retirement plan. These are in that kind of idealistic in the Western world. In Iraqi Kurdistan, there's no prospects or guarantees of prospects. Not only that, there's you don't now just have political issues related to, let's say, the price of oil in the market. You have regional issues. The Kurdish region is a very, very insecure place, not just because of the political parties, but now it's a territory for militias and competing wars. And also, put the salary aside, regardless of who you are and how much status you have. What about the basics, basic services? Even if I, as a university lecturer, have been offered numerous jobs, nice apartments, but I've been given guarantees that you'll never have electricity problems. If I'm happy and I have a family and we go to private school and I go out, as Destan said, into society and everybody else is depressed, what kind of conversations do people have? And those echo chambers, those physical echo chambers, they then have a massive repercussion on the mental health aspect of people. And if you kind of look at the psychological impact, which is all the kind of mental health issues that are fast growing now, youths that see a way out and are courageous enough will jump across the border and find some money and have a relative that will help them. Those who don't develop all sorts of addictions, despondencies and various, I can't explain all of the mental health issues, but the Rehat Hamaziz example was a massive one to kind of contextualize that this guy wins an award and he's on his way to major success and having a life of stardom, and he takes his life the very next day to make a point that, even though I'm this gifted artist with this great future ahead of me, one of those stars in the region, and if you could easily compare him to a Bob Marley, a Marvin Gaye, somebody who, you know, at that age, even they weren't doing what Rehat was doing. But he made a point. He was so depressed and pessimistic about the future. And this is where, again, part of our understanding needs to expand beyond a salary and a job does not, you know, bring happiness. You know, on a most basic level, you want to go out into society and see happy people, not people poor, not people with money issues, and the constant insecurity. I mean, I wouldn't know because I've been lucky enough to be in the UK since I was 5 years old. But for the majority of people, those echo chambers of that negativity that only will lead and exacerbate mental health issues, even if they're not spoken and they're not as evident as they seem. And I think the reason that I kind of take it back to the authoritarian regime is because theory didn't meet practice. The expectation on this KDP and PUK, especially in the constitution deal that we got in 2005, we should have become the pinnacle of the Middle East. We could have even been ahead of some of these key players. You see Saudi Arabia with their village now, the UAE. The Kurds had an even better bargain. They were looked up to for such a long period, or such a short period in the beginning. So this is kind of why it's important to really look at all the factors and see how they play out. But you're right, for some people, it is as simple as they've got the salary and they still want to leave, which, you know, I understand those guys as well.
Thank you very much to our dear participants for really getting this conversation going. We could go on for another half an hour. And of course, thanks immensely to our colleagues, Dastan Jassim and also Dr. Bama Nouri, and of course, to my colleague, Dr. Bahar Bashir. Perhaps I can wrap it up with one sentence. Next year, it will mark 20 years since the US-led intervention or invasion of Iraqi Kurdistan in 2003. The Kurds, I argue, in a recent forthcoming article, were promised peace and prosperity will replace impoverishment of the preceding decades, and as well as in the 90s, and as well as genocide and destitutions in the 90s and in 80s, which of course led to mass exodus. And people people promised, believed the promise that finally they will get to enjoy the life. And in the middle of that kind of deal, or this kind of bargain that Kak Bama was alluding to, was that the unspoken deal was that the Kurdish parties will deliver rising quality of life, or a good life, in return for acquiescence. 20 years on, that hasn't come to fruition, or not a shared prosperity, I would say. But I will leave it there for now. And really great to have you all joining us and staying with us thus far. And really, we are grateful also again for the Center for Kurdish Progress, to our colleagues, Dr. Bammo and Dastan, and of course to my colleague, Dr. Bahar, and for our colleagues at Center for Kurdish Progress to organize this talk. And of course, last but not least, to all our dear participants for joining us. Enjoy the weekend, and hopefully we will see you soon in a more uplifting conversations. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Great weekend.